The mud of the Appalachian Mountains did not just cover Kestrel Strickland. It consumed her. It became her skin. At 26 years old, Kestrel lay perfectly motionless beneath the roots of a massive, overturned white oak. The sky above her was not a sky at all, but a violent, bruised canopy of black and purple. Hurricane Odin, a monstrous Category 4 tempest that had defied every meteorological model, was currently tearing the state of North Carolina apart. The wind did not howl, it screamed. It was a physical, concussive force, snapping century-old pines like dry matchsticks and turning the relentless sheets of rain into horizontal barrages of liquid shrapnel. But Kestrel was not afraid of the storm. She had been born in the shadow of them. As the icy water washed over her camouflage, her mind slipped backward. 14 years backward, to the violent shores of the Atlantic. Hurricane Sandy, 2012. She was 12 years old again, standing on the porch of a coastal house that was trembling under the weight of the incoming ocean. Her father, a veteran United States Coast Guard rescue swimmer, was kneeling in front of her. His hands, calloused and strong, held a heavy, brass-cased analog compass. The modern world relies on satellites, Kestrel, her father had said, his voice a steady rumble beneath the shrieking wind. They rely on batteries and circuit boards and things that live in the sky. But when the sky falls, when the water rises, all of that dies. Technology will lie to you when the elements get angry. But the earth, the magnetic north, the rhythm of the storm, they never lie. You just have to know how to listen. He had pressed the cold brass compass into her small hands. He was already wearing his survival suit. He was going out into a sea that was guaranteed to kill him because a distress call had come in from a sinking trawler. "You don't have to go," young Kestrel had pleaded, her voice cracking. Her father had smiled, a sad, proud smile that Kestrel would spend the rest of her life chasing. "We have a code, sweetheart. We don't leave people behind. Not in the dark, not in the water. We go out. We don't have to come back." He had walked into the freezing surf of Hurricane Sandy and never returned. Now, 14 years later, a brilliant flash of lightning shattered the Appalachian darkness, bringing Kestrel violently back to the present. The thunder detonated a fraction of a second later, a deafening boom that vibrated through the bedrock and deep into her chest. She was no longer a terrified 12-year-old girl. She was Petty Officer First Class Kestrel Strickland, call sign Valkyrie. She was a sniper for SEAL Team 6, and she was currently living a nightmare. 12 hours earlier, this had been a high-priority, covert retrieval operation. A highly classified, experimental stealth drone, operating out of an undisclosed testing facility, had suffered a catastrophic engine failure and plummeted into the most rugged, inaccessible expanse of the Appalachian Mountains. The drone itself was a loss, but the encrypted data core it carried inside its titanium housing was priceless. If that core fell into the wrong hands, decades of American aerial superiority would be erased overnight. SEAL Team 6 had been deployed to find the wreckage, extract the core, and vanish before Hurricane Odin made landfall. They had been led by Master Chief Callahan Braxton. Braxton was a ghost from a different era. At 58 years old, he was one of the last serving operators who had cut his teeth in the brutal, analog shadow wars of the late 20th century. He had fought in the sands of Operation Desert Storm. He had hunted targets in the freezing mountains of the Hindu Kush. He was a man composed of old iron, strict discipline, and an uncompromising sense of honor. To the younger guys in the squad, Braxton was a demanding, terrifying relic. To Kestrel, he was the closest thing she had to a father. Braxton had seen past her gender, past her quiet demeanor, and recognized the absolute, unwavering predator that lived behind her eyes. He had honed her. He had taught her that a sniper is not just a shooter, but a master of patience, geometry, and suffering. But even Braxton could not outmaneuver the wrath of God. Hurricane Odin had accelerated. It had shifted course, slamming into the Carolina coastline and pushing inland with unprecedented ferocity. It hit the mountains while the SEALs were still navigating a deep river gorge. What was supposed to be a knee-deep creek crossing had transformed into a raging, boiling torrent of brown water, uprooted trees and crushing boulders. The flash flood had come out of nowhere, a 30-foot wall of muddy destruction roaring down the canyon. Braxton had been at the rear. He always took the rear guard. It was his philosophy. The leader bears the most risk. He had physically shoved two younger operators up the slick embankment, saving their lives just as the crest of the flood hit. Kestrel remembered looking back. She remembered the sound of the water, like a freight train made of mud. She remembered seeing Braxton, holding the heavy waterproof case containing the drone's data core, look up at the incoming wave. He hadn't panicked. He hadn't screamed. He had just looked at Kestrel, his jaw set in a grim, accepting line. Then the water took him. The flood had swept him away into the churning, violent darkness of the gorge. The hours that followed were a chaotic blur of survival. The surviving members of the team had scrambled up the cliffs, seeking shelter in a shallow cave system as the hurricane fully unleashed its fury. Inside the cave, the reality of their situation had set in. The storm was generating massive atmospheric interference. Their high-tech satellite radios emitted nothing but static. Their GPS trackers spun wildly, unable to penetrate the thick cloud cover in the mountainous terrain. The advanced thermal optics they carried were rendered completely blind by the sheer volume of freezing rain and the ambient drop in temperature. The modern American war machine had been neutralized by the weather. The squad's executive officer, a pragmatic, by-the-book lieutenant 10 years younger than Braxton, had made the call. "We are blind, deaf, and stranded," the XO had shouted over the roar of the wind echoing in the cave. "The valley is flooded. The extraction point is compromised." Master Chief Braxton took a direct hit from a 30-foot wall of water and debris. Nobody survives that. I am declaring him killed in action. As soon as the eye of the storm passes, we are abandoning the search and falling back to the secondary rally point to await emergency medevac. The younger operators had nodded, their faces pale, shivering in their wet gear. It was the logical choice. It was the doctrinal choice. It was the only way to ensure the survival of the remaining team members. But Kestrel had not nodded. She had sat in the back of the cave, her hands methodically stripping, cleaning, and reassembling the bolt of her MK-11 sniper rifle in the dark. The metallic clack of the weapon parts was the only sound she made. "Petty Officer Strickland," the XO had said, turning to her, "acknowledge the order." Kestrel had looked up. Her eyes, pale and sharp, reflected the dim light of a glow stick. She thought of her father, sinking into the freezing Atlantic. She thought of Braxton, shoving his men to safety before the water swallowed him. "With respect, sir," Kestrel had said, her voice eerily calm against the backdrop of the hurricane. "The Master Chief is not dead until I see a body. I am not leaving. That is a direct order, Valkyrie," the XO had warned, stepping closer. "He is gone. The mission is a wash. We are in a Category 4 hurricane. If you go out there alone, you are committing suicide. I will not lose another operator to this storm." Kestrel had stood up. She was not a large woman. She stood 5'6", lean and corded with muscle. But in that cave, she seemed to take up all the air in the room. She reached up and unclipped her heavy tactical helmet, dropping it onto the stone floor. She unfastened the mounting bracket for her panoramic night vision goggles, useless in this deluge, and discarded them. She unstrapped the encrypted digital radio, the GPS module, the thermal scope attachment. Piece by piece, she stripped away the millions of dollars of cutting-edge technology that the United States Navy had issued her. She kept only 4 things: her MK-11 sniper rifle, her father's vintage Colt M1911A1 sidearm, chambered in .45 caliber, her standard issue K-bar combat knife, and the heavy, brass-cased analog compass her father had given her on the day he died. "You rely on the screens, Lieutenant," Kestrel had whispered, stepping past him toward the mouth of the cave. "The screens say he's dead. My gut says he's not. I'm going to find my Master Chief." "Strickland, if you walk out that perimeter, you are acting on your own. You will have no backup, no comms, and no extraction." "I know," Kestrel had replied. She had stepped out of the cave and let the hurricane swallow her. That had been 3 hours ago. Now, lying in the mud beneath the overturned oak, Kestrel checked her brass compass. The needle held steady, pointing north despite the atmospheric chaos. She wiped the thick, cold mud from her eyes and forced her breathing to slow. In through the nose, out through the mouth, controlling the heart rate, controlling the fear. She was operating purely on instinct, training, and the analog skills she had honed over a lifetime. Tracking a man through a pristine forest is difficult. Tracking a man through a Category 4 hurricane is considered practically impossible. The wind erased footprints. The rain washed away blood trails. The falling debris altered the landscape by the minute. But Kestrel knew that water follows gravity, and heavy objects follow water. She had hiked down the treacherous, slippery embankment to the edge of the swollen river. She had calculated the velocity of the flash flood, the curvature of the canyon walls, and the likely snag points where a human body, or a heavy waterproof case, might be deposited. For 2 hours she had found nothing but destruction. Uprooted trees, dead wildlife, boulders the size of minivans. Then she found the first anomaly. A piece of olive-drab nylon webbing snagged on the jagged edge of a shattered slate rock. Kestrel had inspected it closely. The edges of the tear were fresh, the fibers bright green against the mud. It was the strap from Braxton's tactical harness. She had moved up the embankment, abandoning the river edge, following the natural contour of the land. If Braxton had survived the water, he would have dragged himself to high ground to escape the rising flood lines. He would have sought shelter from the wind. 10 minutes later, she had picked up a signal, not on a digital screen, but an analog radio frequency. Before leaving the cave, Kestrel had tuned a small, old-school emergency receiver in her kit to the squad's distress frequency. It was a localized ping designed to emit a short-range pulse that could cut through heavy weather. Beep, beep, beep. The sound was weak, barely audible over the roaring wind, but it was there. Hope, fierce and burning, had flared in her chest. The Master Chief was alive. He had activated his beacon. She had tracked the signal for a mile, moving with the meticulous, agonizing slowness of a sniper on the stalk. She placed each foot carefully, feeling through the soles of her boots for dry twigs or loose rocks before committing her weight. Even in the deafening roar of the hurricane, a trained ear could catch the unnatural snap of a branch. The signal grew stronger. It was coming from a dense thicket of mountain laurel, nestled beneath an overhanging cliff face that provided a natural shield against the rain. Kestrel had dropped to her stomach. She chambered around in her Mk-11, the oiled bolt sliding forward with a satisfying, metallic click. She crawled the last 50 yards, the mud seeping through her uniform, the cold biting deep into her bones. She reached the edge of the thicket. She parted the wet, waxy leaves with the muzzle of her rifle, her eyes scanning the shadows for the familiar, broad-shouldered silhouette of her mentor. What she saw made the blood freeze in her veins. There was no Master Chief Braxton. Lying in the center of the clearing, sheltered from the rain, was the massive, gray-furred carcass of an Appalachian timber wolf. Kestrel stared at it, her mind struggling to process the image. The wolf had not been killed by a falling tree. It had not drowned. Its throat had been slashed with a deep, precise cut. The animal's rib cage had been violently pried open, and resting inside the bloody, hollowed-out chest cavity of the wolf, blinking with a small, mocking red LED light, was Braxton's emergency transponder. Kestrel didn't move. She stopped breathing. Her eyes darted wildly around the perimeter of the clearing, scanning the tree line, the rocks, the shadows. This was not a natural disaster. The flood may have been an act of God, but this, the butchered wolf, the planted beacon, this was an act of man. This was a deliberate, calculated decoy. Someone was out here. Someone had found Braxton before she did. They had taken him. They had stripped his transponder and buried it inside the flesh of a dead animal to spoof the United States military. They wanted the SEAL team to think Braxton was somewhere he wasn't. They wanted to buy time. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. The high-tech drone, the classified data core, the sudden, violent ambush of the weather. They weren't just fighting a hurricane, they were operating in a compromised environment. Kestrel slowly backed out of the thicket, inch by inch, refusing to turn her back on the clearing. Her mind was racing, cataloging every piece of data. Who could pull off an operation like this in the middle of a Category 4 superstorm? A local militia? No, they wouldn't have the discipline to operate in this weather. Cartel smugglers? They wouldn't care about a military data core. This required extreme training. This required operators who were comfortable in the worst conditions planet Earth could produce. Kestrel reached down into the mud near the edge of the thicket. She traced the outline of a depression in the soil. The rain was rapidly washing it away, but the deep grooves of the tread pattern were still visible for a fleeting second. It was a boot print. But it was not the Vibram sole of a standard-issue American combat boot. It was wider, heavier, with a distinct, aggressive lug pattern designed for mountainous tundra. Kestrel had studied foreign equipment profiles for years. She knew that print. It was a Russian design, specifically tactical winter gear. She stood up, the rain lashing against her face. She closed her eyes and let her analog senses take over. She ignored the noise of the storm and focused on the geography. If they had taken Braxton, they would need an extraction point. They couldn't fly a helicopter in this wind. They couldn't drive a vehicle up the flooded mountain roads. They would have to move on foot, seeking the highest possible elevation, where a hardened, secure bunker or an extraction beacon could be established once the eye of the storm passed over. She checked her compass. She looked at the towering, jagged peak of Mount Mitchell looming in the distance, barely visible through the gray curtain of rain. They were heading up. Kestrel began to move. She didn't run. Running leaves deep tracks. Running causes exhaustion. She moved with the fluid, relentless pace of a persistence hunter. She became a ghost in the storm, blending her silhouette with the swaying trees, timing her movements with the heaviest gusts of wind so the shaking of the branches would mask her passage. An hour later, the terrain grew steeper. The mud gave way to slick, treacherous granite. Kestrel paused behind a massive boulder. She wiped the rain from the lenses of her optical scope, pure, unpowered glass. She raised the heavy Mk-11 to her shoulder and scanned the ridgeline 200 yards above her. A flash of lightning illuminated the mountain for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Through the crosshairs, magnified tenfold, Kestrel saw them. There were 5 men. They were massive, clad in dark, waterproof tactical gear that shed the rain. They wore no insignia, no flags, no identifying markers. They were moving up a narrow goat path, battling the ferocious headwind. And in the center of their formation, his hands bound behind his back with heavy zip ties, limping badly and bleeding from a nasty gash on his forehead, was Master Chief Callahan Braxton. He was alive. He didn't have the waterproof case containing the drone core, which meant one of the mercenaries was carrying it. Kestrel's finger instinctively drifted to the trigger of her rifle. The range was 200 yards. Under normal conditions, that was a chip shot. She could drop the man walking behind Braxton before his brain registered the sound of the gunshot. But these were not normal conditions. The wind was whipping across the gorge at a sustained speed of 80 miles per hour, with gusts pushing over 120. A .762 caliber bullet, no matter how perfectly loaded, would be pushed feet off target by that kind of lateral force. If she missed, she would give away her position. They would execute Braxton on the spot and vanish over the ridge. She had to hold her fire. She had to observe. She watched the men move. She studied their gait, their spacing, their discipline. They did not huddle together against the cold. They maintained a perfect, textbook, 5-meter spacing. When the point man stopped, the rest of the squad instantly dropped to a knee, covering 360 degrees of the perimeter. When they communicated, they didn't shout over the storm. They used sharp, precise hand signals. Kestrel felt a cold chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the freezing rain. She recognized the hand signals. She recognized the specific way the rear guard scanned his sector, a sweeping, mechanical motion that left 0 blind spots. Braxton had made her read the old manuals, the declassified CIA dossiers from the 1980s. He had taught her about the adversaries he had faced in the shadows of the Cold War. "They don't fight like us, Kestrel," Braxton's voice echoed in her memory. "We rely on air support. We rely on overwhelming firepower. They rely on suffering. They embrace the cold. They operate behind enemy lines for months with nothing but a knife and a compass. They are wolves." The men walking up that ridge were not a modern, high-tech strike team. They were old school. They were Spetsnaz. Specifically, they were utilizing a patrol doctrine that hadn't been taught in the Russian military academies since the fall of the Soviet Union. This meant these men were not young recruits. They were veterans. They were hard, seasoned killers who had survived decades of covert warfare. And the man leading them, a towering figure walking point, moving with a terrifying, predatory grace despite the howling wind, pointed up the mountain with a gloved hand. Even from 200 yards away, Kestrel could sense the authority radiating from him. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know that his name was Vladimir Kharkov. She didn't know that he was 62 years old, or that he carried a jagged, faded scar across his chest from a combat knife wielded by Callahan Braxton in a dusty alleyway in Beirut 35 years ago. She didn't know that this was not a simple smash-and-grab operation for military technology. She didn't know that this was a deeply personal blood feud, reignited on American soil under the cover of a superstorm. All Kestrel knew was that these men had her Master Chief. They had stolen American secrets, and they were extremely dangerous. The Spetsnaz unit crested the ridge and disappeared into the thick pine forest on the other side, dragging Braxton with them. Kestrel lowered her rifle. She looked down at the brass compass in her hand. The needle pointed steady and true. She was entirely alone. She had no radio. She had no backup. If she died out here, her body would be swallowed by the mud and forgotten. The smart play, the military doctrine play, was to turn around, find a secure bunker, ride out the storm, and report the enemy coordinates to command when the skies cleared. But Kestrel thought of her father, sinking beneath the black waves of the Atlantic, his hand reaching out, refusing to let go of the man he was trying to save. "We go out. We don't have to come back." Kestrel snapped the lid of the compass shut. She slipped it into her breast pocket, right over her heart. She checked the heavy, worn grip of her father's 1911 pistol strapped to her thigh. She touched the leather handle of the K-bar knife on her vest. She was outgunned. She was outnumbered 5-1. She was facing elite, hardened Cold War killers in the middle of a Category 4 hurricane. And as she stepped out from behind the boulder and began the long, brutal climb up the mountain to hunt them down, Kestrel Strickland didn't feel fear. She felt focused. The high-tech war was over. The screens were dead. The satellites were blind. The storm had dragged them all back to the Stone Age. And in the dark, in the mud, with only iron and grit to rely on, Kestrel knew exactly who she was. She was a Valkyrie, and she was going to bring her Master Chief home. The thunder roared across the Appalachian peaks, masking the sound of her boots hitting the stone. The hunt had begun. The Appalachian Mountain Ridge was a jagged spine of ancient rock, currently being battered by the full, apocalyptic fury of Hurricane Odin. Kestrel Strickland did not fight the mountain, and she did not fight the storm. She let the freezing rain wash over her, let the mud coat her uniform, turning her into a living extension of the forest floor. She was a sniper. Her primary weapon was not the Mk-11 rifle slung across her back, but her infinite, terrifying capacity for patience. Ahead of her, the Spetsnaz patrol moved with the rigid, mechanical precision of men who had spent their entire lives preparing for war. They were 5 heavy infantrymen, dragging Master Chief Callahan Braxton up the steep incline toward a cluster of high granite outcroppings. The wind was a physical wall, pushing back against them with sustained gusts of 140 miles per hour. Trees groaned and snapped, their massive trunks splintering like dry bones. Kestrel wiped a layer of grime from her analog optical scope. No batteries, no thermal imaging, no digital rangefinders. In this weather, the modern American military machine was completely blind. But Kestrel's eyes were clear. She watched the rear guard of the Russian formation. He was a massive man, his face obscured by a neoprene mask, his head constantly swiveling on a pivot, scanning the tree line. He was good, but he was looking for a modern strike team. He was looking for laser sights and thermal blooms. He was not looking for a single 26-year-old woman armed with a brass compass and the dead reckoning skills of a bygone era. She needed to thin their numbers. 5 against 1 in a frontal assault was suicide, even with the element of surprise. She crawled to the base of an uprooted pine tree, resting the heavy barrel of her Mk-11 over a thick root. She clicked the magnification ring on her scope. The reticle settled on the center of the rearguard's chest. The distance was exactly 75 yards. Under clear skies, she could make that shot blindfolded. But in a Category 4 hurricane, a 7.62 millimeter round would be blown wildly off course by the lateral shear of the wind. She had to wait for the lull. Her father had taught her that every storm breathes. It inhales and it exhales. Between the monstrous, roaring gusts, there is always a fraction of a second where the air pressure equalizes. A momentary pocket of dead air. Kestrel slowed her heart rate. She ignored the freezing water soaking through her boots. She ignored the burning ache in her shoulders. She became entirely focused on the rhythm of the wind. She watched the violent swaying of the pine branches ahead of her. The wind screamed, peaking in a massive gust that nearly tore her off the rock. Then, the branches snapped back. The howling dropped half an octave. The storm was inhaling. Lightning flashed, illuminating the gorge in a stark, magnesium-white strobe. Kestrel knew the thunder would follow in exactly 1.2 seconds. She exhaled. She squeezed the heavy steel trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The sound of the gunshot was instantly, completely swallowed by the earth-shattering boom of the thunder overhead. Through the glass, she saw the rearguard's head snap backward. His knees buckled, and he collapsed silently into the thick mountain laurel, his heavy body swallowed by the underbrush. He did not cry out. He simply ceased to exist. The man walking point and the 2 men flanking Braxton did not turn around. They had heard nothing but the wrath of the heavens. They kept moving, fighting the steep elevation, completely unaware that their rearguard was dead in the mud. Kestrel racked the bolt of her rifle. The spent brass casing ejected, tumbling into the dirt. She scooped it up instantly and shoved it into her pocket. Leave no trace. Be a ghost. She moved laterally, flanking the patrol on the high ground. She scrambled over slick boulders and crawled beneath fallen timber, closing the distance. She was a shadow moving within the chaos of the storm. 10 minutes later, the patrol reached a treacherous bottleneck. The goat path narrowed, flanked by a sheer cliff on the left and a deadly, rocky drop-off on the right. The Spetsnaz formation had to tighten. The man on the right flank stepped close to the edge to let Braxton and his captor pass. Kestrel was already in position, perched on a rock ledge 40 yards above them. She waited for the sky to light up. The flash came. 1. Point. 2. The thunder detonated. Kestrel fired. The right flank guard took the round directly in the side of his Kevlar helmet. The kinetic energy lifted him off his feet, and he plummeted backward off the edge of the cliff, disappearing into the raging river gorge hundreds of feet below. There was no splash to hear, no body to find, just the wind screaming in the void. 3 left. Kestrel was in total, absolute control. She was dismantling an elite Cold War hit squad with the cold, mechanical precision of a surgeon. The Spetsnaz leader, the massive man walking point, raised his fist. The patrol ground to a halt. He turned his head, his eyes scanning the empty space where his 2 men had just been. Even through the torrential rain, Kestrel could see the sudden shift in his posture. He did not panic. He did not shout. He simply dropped to one knee and raised his weapon, his combat instincts instantly registering that they were being hunted. He grabbed Braxton by the collar of his tactical vest and dragged the Master Chief forcefully toward the entrance of a deep, naturally formed rock fissure that cut into the side of the mountain. It was an old Appalachian bear cave, deep enough to offer complete protection from the wind and the rain. The remaining guard followed them inside, sweeping his rifle across the tree line. Kestrel lowered her weapon. The killing field was gone. They were in hard cover. She slung the Mk-11 over her shoulder and began the slow, agonizing descent toward the mouth of the fissure. She had to know what she was up against. She had to know why they had taken Braxton alive. She approached the cave from the blind side, pressing her back flat against the freezing granite wall. The storm raged behind her, but as she edged closer to the dark opening, the roar of the wind became muffled. The heavy stone absorbed the sound, creating an eerie, tense pocket of relative quiet. She drew the heavy Colt 1911 pistol from her thigh holster. She thumbed the safety off. The mechanical click was terrifyingly loud in her own ears, but the ambient noise of the storm masked it from the men inside. She pressed her ear against the cold, wet rock near the fissure's entrance. Voices. Speaking English, but heavily accented. The gravelly, authoritative baritone of a man used to giving orders that resulted in death. "You have gotten old, Callahan." Kestrel stopped breathing. She knew that name. No one called the Master Chief by his first name. A heavy thud echoed from inside the cave, followed by a sharp, choked gasp of pain. They were beating him. "Your men are weak," the Russian voice continued. The tone was conversational, almost disappointed. "The new generation. They rely on the satellites. They rely on the drones. Take away the batteries and they are children playing in the mud. Look at you, the great American legend, swept away by water." Callahan Braxton's voice cut through the darkness. It was ragged, wet with blood, but it did not shake. It was pure iron. "You came a long way to steal a drone corps, Vladimir. You could have bought the schematics on the black market, but you had to come yourself. You had to cross the wire." Vladimir. Kestrel's mind raced through the classified dossiers Braxton had forced her to memorize. Vladimir Kharkov, a legendary Spetsnaz commander, a ghost of the Soviet-Afghan War, a man the CIA had officially declared dead 3 separate times. "The drone corps is for the men who pay my invoices," Kharkov replied, his boots crunching on the stone floor. "But you, Callahan, you are for me. Do you remember Beirut, 1991? I remember you bleeding like a stuck pig in an alleyway," Braxton spat. Another brutal thud. Braxton grunted heavily. "I carry the scar of your knife every day," Kharkov said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. "You took my honor in that alley, Callahan. You took my team. I have waited 35 years to look you in the eyes while your country burns. When this storm breaks, my extraction team will arrive. We will take the core, and I will leave your head on a spike for your young, pathetic SEALs to find." Outside the cave, Kestrel's grip tightened on the handle of her 1911 until her knuckles turned white. This was not a retrieval mission anymore. This was a blood feud. Kharkov had specifically targeted Braxton's unit. He had used the storm as cover to execute a 35-year-old vendetta. "You're missing 2 men, Kharkov," Braxton said, his voice laced with a grim, knowing satisfaction. "You think the storm took them? You don't know my team. You don't know who is out there in the dark with you." Kharkov laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "A sniper? In a Category 4 hurricane? No one can shoot in this wind, Callahan. Not even you." "I told you," Braxton whispered. "You don't know my team." Kestrel stepped back from the rock wall. She had heard enough. She knew the layout. Kharkov, Braxton, and 1 guard inside the deep fissure. She could not breach a fatal funnel like a cave entrance with a bolt-action sniper rifle. She needed an angle. She needed to draw them out, or find a secondary ventilation shaft to drop a fragmentation grenade into. She turned away from the cave and began to scale the rock face to her left, seeking the high ground directly above the fissure. But Vladimir Kharkov was not a fool. He was a veteran of 100 covert wars. He had noticed the missing men. He had done the tactical math. A sniper using the thunder to mask the shots. A hunter tracking them from the low ground. If he were the sniper, he would seek the high elevation above the cave entrance to establish a dominating overwatch position. Kharkov had not just retreated into the cave to beat his old enemy. He had retreated to set a trap. Kestrel pulled herself over the lip of the granite ledge directly above the cave entrance. The rain lashed at her face. She crawled on her belly, sliding her Mk-11 forward, preparing to sight down the ridge to cover the only exit. Her left hand brushed against something buried beneath a layer of fresh pine needles. It was a thin, incredibly taut piece of synthetic Kevlar wire. A tripwire. Kestrel's eyes went wide. The combat instinct drilled into her by her father and by Braxton flared instantly. She did not freeze. She did not try to back away. She threw her entire body weight violently to the right, launching herself off the granite ledge toward the muddy slope below. A microsecond later, the M18A1 Claymore directional mine detonated. The explosion was a deafening, catastrophic roar that eclipsed even the thunder. 700 steel ball bearings, propelled by a pound of C4 explosive, shredded the airspace exactly where Kestrel's head had been a fraction of a second prior. The concussive shockwave hit her midair. It felt like being struck by a speeding truck. The blast threw her 10 feet down the muddy embankment. She slammed into the trunk of a dead oak tree, the breath driven from her lungs in a violent rush. Pain, hot and blinding, erupted in her left thigh. A piece of jagged rock, weaponized by the explosion, had ripped through her tactical pants and torn a deep gash through the muscle. Kestrel lay in the mud, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the storm. Her vision swam, blurring into a chaotic swirl of gray rain and black earth. She choked, coughing up a mouthful of muddy water. She forced her eyes open. She reached blindly for her Mk-11 rifle. Her hand found twisted metal and splintered fiberglass. The sniper rifle, the precision instrument that had made her the deadliest operator in her unit, had taken the brunt of the Claymore's blast. The scope was shattered into powder. The barrel was bent. The receiver was cracked wide open. The weapon was completely, irreparably destroyed. She was unarmed. She was bleeding. She was alone. From the cave below, she heard the crunch of heavy boots on stone. Kharkov's remaining guard was moving up the ridge to inspect the kill zone. "Check the body," Kharkov's voice echoed over the ringing in her ears. "Bring me the dog tags." Kestrel bit her lips so hard she tasted copper. The pain in her thigh was agonizing, a constant throbbing fire. Every doctrine, every survival manual told her to stay down, to play dead, to hope the guard overlooked her in the heavy rain. But Kestrel Strickland was the daughter of a man who swam into hurricanes. She dragged herself behind the massive root system of the dead oak tree. Her hands shook as she unclipped the heavy nylon tourniquet from her chest rig. She wrapped it high and tight around her left thigh, above the bleeding gash. She twisted the windlass rod, biting down on the collar of her uniform to muffle her own scream of agony as the nylon bit deep into her flesh, cutting off the arterial blood flow. The bleeding slowed, the pain intensified, a dull, crushing ache. She reached down and scooped up a handful of thick, freezing Appalachian mud. She packed it directly into the open wound, sealing it against the elements and masking the scent of fresh blood. She shed the useless, broken remnants of her Mk-11. She unbuckled her heavy tactical chest rig, discarding the extra rifle magazines that were now just dead weight. She stripped away everything that made her a modern soldier. She stood up. She leaned her weight against the oak tree, testing the injured leg. It held, barely. She reached down to her right thigh and unholstered the Colt 1911. She checked the chamber. 1 round in the pipe, 7 in the magazine. Heavy, slow, brutal .45 caliber stoppers. With her left hand, she drew the K-bar combat knife from its leather sheath. The blackened steel blade was 7 inches of razor-sharp menace, the stacked leather handle worn smooth by years of practice. The high-tech sniper was dead. The explosion had killed her. What rose from the mud behind the oak tree was something much older and much more dangerous. She was a primal hunter, stripped of technology, relying on nothing but cold steel, gunpowder, and the absolute terrifying will to survive. The Spetsnaz guard crested the ridge. He was holding an AK-74 assault rifle, scanning the blackened blast zone of the claymore. The rain washed the smoke away instantly. He stepped carefully over the shattered remains of Kestrel's sniper rifle, his eyes searching the underbrush for a shredded corpse. He didn't look up. He didn't look at the massive oak tree directly to his left. He was looking for a victim. He wasn't looking for a predator. Kestrel did not shoot. A gunshot would alert Kharkov down in the cave. She moved with terrifying silence, her boots finding purchase in the soft mud. The storm howled, masking the sound of her approach. She stepped out from behind the oak tree, stepping directly into the guard's blind spot. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the morality of the act. She thought of her master chief, bleeding in the dark. Kestrel struck. Her left arm lashed out, the heavy K-bar driving upward in a brutal, practiced arc. The blade slid effortlessly through the gap between the guard's Kevlar vest and his tactical belt, burying itself deep into his right kidney. The guard's eyes went wide. His mouth opened in a silent scream, his body instantly paralyzed by the catastrophic shock to his central nervous system. Before he could pull the trigger of his rifle, Kestrel's right hand whipped up. She brought the heavy steel frame of the 1911 pistol down in a crushing pistol whip against the base of his skull. The Spetsnaz veteran collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. Kestrel caught his weight, lowering him silently into the mud. She twisted the K-bar, pulling the blade free. She wiped the blackened steel clean on the dead man's uniform. 4 down, 1 to go. She stood over the body of the Russian mercenary. The rain washed the mud from her face, revealing eyes that were completely devoid of fear. She looked down at the entrance of the cave, where Vladimir Kharkov was waiting for his guard to return. Kharkov thought he was fighting a broken, modern military. He thought he had outsmarted a sniper with a wire and a pound of explosives. He had no idea that he had just forced Kestrel Strickland to stop playing by the rules of modern warfare. He had forced her to fight like the men of her father's generation. Brutal, close, unforgiving. Kestrel gripped the leather handle of the K-bar. She checked the heavy brass compass over her heart. The storm was reaching its absolute peak. The sky was black. The wind was a solid wall of force. It was a beautiful night for a hunt. She stepped over the dead Spetsnaz guard and began her silent descent toward the cave, the heavy Colt 1911 steady in her hand. The Valkyrie was coming for the wolf. The mouth of the Appalachian rock fissure swallowed Kestrel Strickland whole. Behind her, Hurricane Odin continued to tear the world apart, ripping century-old trees from the bedrock and turning the sky into a churning ocean of black clouds and horizontal rain. But as Kestrel limped deeper into the granite throat of the mountain, the deafening roar of the storm began to fade. It was replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the steady drip of freezing water and the harsh, ragged sound of her own breathing. The pain in her left thigh was a living, breathing thing. The tourniquet she had applied after the Claymore explosion was biting deep into her muscle, starving her leg of oxygen and blood. Every step was an agonizing negotiation with gravity, but she did not stop. She kept the heavy Colt 1911 pistol raised, her right hand wrapped tight around the checkered walnut grips, her left hand gripping the blood-stained handle of the K-bar combat knife. The narrow rock tunnel descended at a sharp angle. The walls were smooth, unnatural. Kestrel ran her fingertips along the stone. There were drill marks. This was not a natural bear cave. Braxton had taught her the history of these mountains. During the height of the Cold War, the United States government had hollowed out dozens of peaks along the Appalachian Trail. They had built deep, subterranean continuity of government bunkers, designed to house politicians and military commanders in the event of a Soviet nuclear strike. Most had been decommissioned in the 90s, their coordinates buried in forgotten archives. Vladimir Kharkov had not chosen this mountain by accident. He had not walked into a Category 4 hurricane blind. He was a Spetsnaz ghost who had spent his prime years studying American infrastructure, planning for a war that never officially came. He had navigated the flood and the storm perfectly, bringing his high-value hostage to a fortified, subterranean stronghold. Kestrel rounded a jagged bend in the tunnel and stopped. 50 feet ahead, illuminated by the harsh, chemical glare of industrial glow sticks, stood a massive pair of rusted steel blast doors. They were partially wedged open, the hydraulic hinges long since dead. Kestrel pressed her back against the cold, damp stone. She lowered her breathing, closing her eyes and letting her analog senses map the environment. She heard the deep, resonant thud of a heavy fist striking human bone. She heard a wet cough, and then she heard voices. Not just one voice, not just Kharkov and the single guard who had retreated into the cave with him. There were heavy, shifting footsteps echoing off the concrete walls of the bunker. The metallic clatter of rifle magazines being locked into receivers. The low, guttural cadence of Russian being spoken by multiple men. Kharkov's extraction team. They had arrived before the storm hit, navigating the subterranean access tunnels from the valley below, waiting in the dry, fortified belly of the mountain for their commander to arrive with the prize. Kestrel leaned an inch past the rock wall, angling her vision through the gap in the heavy steel doors. The bunker was a massive, concrete-lined cylinder, originally designed as a communications hub. Old, gutted mainframes lined the walls, covered in decades of dust and rust. At the far end of the room was a thick, reinforced glass ventilation port, designed to cycle air from the surface, currently vibrating violently under the atmospheric pressure of the hurricane, raging just a few feet beyond the concrete. In the center of the room, Master Chief Callahan Braxton was bolted to a heavy steel chair. He was stripped of his tactical gear. His face was a swollen, bloody mask. His left leg was bent at a grotesque, unnatural angle, but his eyes, the cold, calculating eyes of a veteran who had survived the worst the 20th century had to offer, were entirely focused. Vladimir Kharkov stood over him. The Russian commander had shed his heavy, wet weather gear. He wore a simple black combat shirt, revealing arms corded with thick muscle, and a chest mapped with old, pale scars. In his right hand, he held a heavy steel wrench. Fanning out around the perimeter of the room were Kharkov's reinforcements. 4 massive, heavily armed Spetsnaz mercenaries. They were fresh. They were dry. They carried modern, short-barreled assault rifles and wore heavy body armor. They were sweeping the corners of the bunker, securing the perimeter, completely unaware that the Grim Reaper had already slipped through the front door. "The codes, Callahan," Kharkov said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that echoed off the concrete. "The decryption sequence for the drone corps. Give it to me, and I will let you die with the dignity of a soldier. Refuse, and I will spend the next 3 hours breaking every bone in your hands." Braxton spat a mouthful of blood onto the concrete floor. He looked up at his oldest enemy and smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile. "You're a dinosaur, Vlad," Braxton rasped. "You came all this way. You brought your best men, but you're trapped in a tomb of your own making. The United States Navy is not going to let you walk out of this mountain. The United States Navy is currently drowning," Kharkov replied coldly, raising the heavy steel wrench. As Kharkov wound up for another strike, Kestrel's eyes snapped to Braxton's right combat boot. The Master Chief was not just resting his foot on the metal leg of the chair. He was tapping it. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. Morse code. Braxton knew. Even though Kestrel had made absolutely no sound, even though she was hidden in the pitch-black shadows of the access tunnel 50 feet away, the old Master Chief knew she was there. He knew his sniper. He knew her relentless, predatory nature. He knew she would never follow the order to retreat. Kestrel focused her eyes on the rhythmic tapping of Braxton's boot, translating the ancient military cipher in her head. VALKYRIE C4 BLOWVENT LEAVEME. He was giving her a direct, tactical command. He had identified the structural weakness of the room, the massive reinforced ventilation port at the far end of the bunker that held back the screaming fury of Hurricane Odin. He was ordering her to use explosives to breach the seal. He wanted her to weaponize the Category 4 storm, to let the catastrophic atmospheric pressure crush the room, and he was ordering her to leave him to die in the process. Kestrel reached into the deep thigh pocket of her tactical pants. Her fingers brushed against a heavy, rectangular block of C4 plastic explosive, rigged with a simple mechanical timer. It was the last piece of demolition ordnance she carried. She looked at Braxton. She saw the blood dripping from his chin. She saw the old man who had treated her not as a female liability, but as a lethal asset. The man who had taught her how to survive. Then she thought of the freezing waters of the Atlantic Ocean. She thought of her father, slipping beneath the waves, refusing to let go of the fisherman he was trying to save. "We go out. We don't have to come back." Kestrel Strickland did not follow the order. She was not going to leave him. She was going to kill every single man in this room, or she was going to die on the concrete floor beside her Master Chief. She slid the block of C4 back into her pocket. She studied the layout of the Cold War bunker with the cold, calculating geometry of a master sniper. 5 enemies, 1 hostage, a single heavy blast door. She looked at the ceiling. Running along the edge of the arched concrete roof were thick, exposed bundles of industrial wiring. They led from the rusty mainframes directly into a massive, heavy-duty electrical breaker box, bolted to the wall just 3 feet to Kestrel's right, inside the dark tunnel. The glow sticks illuminating the room were supplemental. The bunker was drawing its primary ambient power from a generator deeper in the mountain. Kestrel understood the physics of the human eye. When plunged from harsh, artificial light into absolute subterranean darkness, the pupil requires at least 4 seconds to dilate and adjust. For 4 seconds, a human being is completely, fundamentally blind. 4 seconds was a lifetime for a Valkyrie. She holstered the Colt 1911. She needed both hands. She gripped the leather handle of her K-bar knife in her right hand, holding it in a reverse, tactical grip. With her left hand, she reached out and grabbed the heavy iron handle of the main electrical breaker. She took one final, deep breath, inhaling the smell of ozone, damp earth, and impending death. She pulled the breaker handle down with all her strength. The heavy clack of the iron switch severing the circuit echoed like a gunshot. Instantly, the bunker was plunged into a suffocating, absolute darkness. The supplemental glow sticks cast only a pathetic, localized green hue that barely penetrated the blackness. The humming of the ancient generator died. Shouts erupted in Russian. The metallic clatter of assault rifles being raised filled the air. "Hold fire! Hold fire!" Kharkov roared in the dark, his combat instincts recognizing the danger of a friendly crossfire in a confined space. "Night vision! Activate optics!" They were reaching for their advanced technology. They were reaching for their infrared goggles and their thermal scopes. They were too slow. In the pure analog darkness, Kestrel Strickland moved. She did not run. She exploded forward, launching her body through the gap in the heavy steel blast doors with the terrifying speed of a coiled spring. She ignored the burning agony of the tourniquet on her thigh. She let the adrenaline mask the pain. She had mapped the room in her mind before cutting the lights. She knew exactly where the first guard was standing. 7 paces inside the door, 2 feet to the left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Kestrel lunged. Her left hand shot out in the darkness, her fingers wrapping violently around the thick tactical fabric of the guard's chest rig. She used his own weight against him, pulling him forward off his center of gravity. As the massive Spetsnaz operator stumbled into the dark, Kestrel drove the 7-inch steel blade of the K-bar upward. The knife punched cleanly through the soft tissue beneath his jaw, severing the brainstem instantly. The man died before his knees hit the concrete. Kestrel wrenched the blade free, grabbing the heavy Kevlar collar of his armor and using his falling body as a physical shield. A strobe of green light illuminated the room. One of the guards had activated a weapon-mounted flashlight. The beam swept across the bunker, illuminating the falling body of the first guard. The Spetsnaz operator with the flashlight saw the blood. He saw Kestrel's shadow crouching behind the dead man. He squeezed the trigger of his AK-74. The deafening roar of automatic gunfire shattered the silence of the bunker. Muzzle flashes strobed like lightning, casting horrific, disjointed shadows against the concrete walls. Heavy 5.45 millimeter rounds chewed into the dead body Kestrel was using as cover, the kinetic impacts jerking the corpse in her arms. Kestrel did not flinch. In the strobe of the muzzle flashes, she had acquired her target. She dropped the human shield, dropping to a low crouch. Her right hand slapped down to her thigh, drawing the heavy Colt 1911 in a fluid, practiced motion. She brought the weapon up, her arm locked tight, aligning the iron sights by pure muscle memory. She fired twice. Boom! Boom! The heavy 230-grain, 45 caliber slugs tore through the air. The first round shattered the tactical flashlight, plunging the room back into darkness. The second round caught the Russian operator dead center in the chest, the massive hydrostatic shock folding his heavy body backward like a broken toy. 2 down, 3 left. Left flank. She is on the left, a voice screamed in the dark. Footsteps rushed toward her. They were closing the net. Kestrel scrambled backward, her boots slipping on the blood-slicked concrete. Her injured leg gave out, sending her crashing hard to the floor. A massive shadow loomed over her. The third Spetsnaz guard had closed the distance, his night vision optics glowing with a faint, demonic green hum. He kicked the 1911 pistol out of her hand. The weapon clattered away into the darkness. He grabbed Kestrel by the throat with a hand the size of a dinner plate, lifting her entirely off the ground. He pinned her against the cold, damp wall of the bunker, his grip crushing her windpipe. Kestrel choked, her hands desperately clawing at his thick wrist, her vision beginning to narrow into a dark tunnel. The Russian drew a long, serrated combat knife from his chest rig. He pulled his arm back, preparing to drive the blade directly into Kestrel's heart. He relied on his size. He relied on his strength. He forgot that she was a sniper. He forgot that she understood human anatomy better than anyone else in the room. Kestrel stopped fighting the grip on her throat. She went entirely limp for a fraction of a second, causing the massive operator to overcompensate and lean his body weight slightly forward. In that microsecond, Kestrel struck. She didn't use her hands. She used her right leg, the one that wasn't bound by a tourniquet. She drove her heavy combat boot upward with catastrophic force, the steel-reinforced toe connecting directly with the side of the Russian's knee joint. The cartilage snapped with a sickening, wet crunch. The giant roared in agony, his grip loosening just enough for Kestrel to draw a breath. She dropped her weight, sliding down the concrete wall. As the operator stumbled backward on his shattered leg, Kestrel whipped her right hand around. The K-bar knife, which she had never dropped, slashed in a vicious horizontal arc. The blackened steel laid open the femoral artery of his uninjured leg. A high-pressure spray of hot blood hit the concrete. The Russian operator collapsed, his hands desperately clutching his thigh, his life pumping out onto the floor in a matter of seconds. 3 down. Kestrel knelt in the darkness, gasping for air, her throat bruised and throbbing. Her thigh was on fire. She had lost her pistol. She only had the knife. Enough! Vladimir Kharkov's voice boomed through the bunker. It was no longer the calm, arrogant tone of a master tactician. It was the raw, furious roar of a cornered predator. A harsh, blinding red flare ignited in the center of the room. Kharkov had cracked an emergency magnesium flare, holding it high above his head. The intense, sputtering red light cast deep, violent shadows across the concrete tomb. Kestrel pressed herself into the darkest corner of the room, her chest heaving. In the center of the bunker, illuminated by the hellish red glow, Kharkov stood behind Callahan Braxton. The fourth and final Spetsnaz guard stood to Kharkov's right, his assault rifle leveled directly at the shadows where Kestrel was hiding. Kharkov had his left arm wrapped tightly around Braxton's throat, using the battered, bleeding Master Chief as a human shield. In his right hand, Kharkov held a heavy, Soviet-era Makarov pistol, the barrel pressed firmly against Braxton's temple. "You fight like a demon, little girl," Kharkov spat, his eyes scanning the darkness, searching for her silhouette. "You killed my best men. You fight with the savagery of the old wars. I respect this, but the game is over." Braxton groaned, struggling against the tight grip on his throat. He looked into the shadows, his eyes finding Kestrel's. "Do it," Braxton mouthed silently. "Shoot." She looked down at the 1911. She still had 6 rounds left, but a .45 caliber pistol was useless here. The angle on Kharkov was impossible, and the red flare created false shadows. If she pulled the trigger, she was just as likely to blow through Braxton's brain as Kharkov's. "I am counting to 3, Kharkov roared, pressing the barrel harder into Braxton's temple. 1. Kestrel holstered the pistol. She reached into her thigh pocket and pulled out the heavy block of C4 plastic explosive. 2. Braxton closed his eyes. He accepted his fate. He had lived a good life. He had trained the best. He was ready. Kestrel felt the heavy brass compass resting against her heart. She felt the rhythm of the mountain. Behind Kharkov, at the far end of the bunker, the heavy, reinforced glass of the ventilation port was rattling violently. Hurricane Odin was clawing at the glass, desperate to get in. She knew she couldn't shoot through Cold War blast glass, but military-grade explosives could shatter the seal. She twisted the mechanical timer on the C4. 3 seconds. 3! Kharkov screamed. Kestrel threw the C4 block like a fastball. It sailed through the dark, flying right past Kharkov's head and slammed into the base of the reinforced ventilation window. Kharkov flinched, turning his head just as the timer hit 0. The C4 detonated. The ancient metal and reinforced glass shattered. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. And then, the wrath of God entered the room. The reinforced glass window blew violently inward. The Category 4 hurricane, carrying sustained winds of 140 miles per hour and a massive, crushing differential in atmospheric pressure, funneled directly into the sealed concrete cylinder of the bunker. It was an explosive decompression in reverse. The sound was unimaginable. It was the roar of a jet engine detonating in a phone booth. A solid wall of freezing water, debris, and tornadic winds slammed into the room with the force of a runaway freight train. The red magnesium flare was instantly snuffed out. The room was plunged into absolute chaotic darkness. The sudden, catastrophic blast of wind hit Kharkov and his remaining guard like a physical fist. The guard was lifted entirely off his feet and thrown violently against the rusty mainframes, his spine snapping upon impact. Kharkov, a massive man, was thrown off balance. His grip on Braxton's throat broke. He stumbled backward, fighting the overwhelming force of the hurricane pushing into the room, his eyes blinded by the driving, horizontal rain inside the bunker. Kestrel had anticipated the blast. She had wedged her boots into the corner of the concrete wall, anchoring her body against the storm. She drew the 1911 again. The wind was screaming. The rain was blinding. The darkness was absolute. But Kestrel Strickland was the daughter of a hurricane. She knew the rhythm. She knew that every storm breathes. She waited for the sky to light up. A massive fork of lightning struck the peak of the mountain outside. The brilliant, jagged light flooded through the shattered ventilation window, illuminating the bunker in a stark, frozen strobe of electric blue. In that microsecond of light, Kestrel saw the board. Callahan Braxton had thrown his body sideways, tipping the heavy steel chair to the floor, clearing the line of fire. Vladimir Kharkov was standing 10 feet away, his arm raised against the wind, his Makarov pistol tracking blindly through the rain toward Kestrel's corner. He was wearing heavy Class 4 body armor. A center mass shot would not penetrate. The wind was whipping laterally across the room at over 100 miles an hour. Kestrel calculated the wind drift. She calculated the drop. She did the math that no computer could do, using the analog instincts forged in blood and mud. She aimed 6 inches to the left of Kharkov's head. The lightning faded. The room went black. Kestrel squeezed the trigger. The Colt 1911 kicked hard. Through the roaring wind, through the driving rain, there was a sharp, wet crack. The sound of heavy lead shattering human bone. A heavy body collapsed onto the concrete floor. And then there was only the sound of the storm. Kestrel slowly lowered the pistol. She didn't move. She kept the weapon leveled at the center of the room, her thumb resting on the hammer. She waited. 10 seconds. 30 seconds. A full minute. Nothing moved in the darkness. Her leg gave out completely. Kestrel collapsed onto the freezing, wet concrete, her back resting against the wall. The pistol slipped from her fingers. The adrenaline that had sustained her for the past 3 hours finally evaporated, leaving behind a cold, crushing wave of agony and exhaustion. She closed her eyes. She let the freezing rain wash over her face. She was so tired. It would be so easy to just drift away. The darkness was comforting. The pain was fading into a numb, distant hum. We go out. She heard the scrape of metal on stone. Kestrel forced her eyes open. Through the howling wind, she saw a shadow dragging itself across the floor toward her. Valkyrie. The voice was weak. It was ragged, but it was alive. Master Chief Callahan Braxton dragged his shattered body across the concrete, pulling the heavy steel chair he was still bolted to. He reached her corner. He reached out with a trembling, blood-stained hand and gripped her shoulder. "I'm here, Master Chief," Kestrel whispered, her voice barely audible over the hurricane. "You didn't follow the order," Braxton rasped, leaning his head back against the wall next to her. "I declined the order, sir." Braxton let out a low, painful chuckle that turned into a wet cough. He looked at the shattered ventilation window, then out into the center of the dark room, where the body of Vladimir Kharkov lay motionless on the floor. A single, .45 caliber bullet hole perfectly centered between his eyes. "Analog," Braxton whispered. "Analog, sir," Kestrel replied. They sat together in the dark, battered, bleeding, and broken, as Hurricane Odin screamed its final, dying breaths through the mountain. The storm broke exactly 4 hours later. The black clouds fractured, giving way to a pale, bruised dawn. The wind died down to a dull whistle. The rain slowed to a heavy mist. The silence that followed the hurricane was almost as deafening as the storm itself. The distinct, rhythmic whump, whump, whump of heavy rotor blades cut through the mountain air. Two United States Navy MH-60 Seahawk helicopters descended into the devastated valley, their landing gear hovering just feet above the flooded, debris-choked riverbed. Heavily armed operators in full combat gear leaped from the side doors, their weapons raised, scanning the tree line. They were not a rescue team. They were a quick reaction force, sent to recover the bodies of SEAL Team 6 and secure the lost drone corps. The QRF commander, a grim-faced lieutenant commander, led his squad up the slick granite embankment, following the coordinate ping of a recovered emergency beacon. They reached the entrance of the rock fissure. They activated their tactical lights and breached the tunnel, moving with precise, lethal efficiency. They expected to find a tomb. They expected to find the butchered remains of their brothers. What they found stopped the entire squad in their tracks. The heavy steel blast doors were wedged open. The concrete floor of the bunker was a slaughterhouse. 5 massive, heavily armored Russian mercenaries lay dead in pools of freezing water and coagulated blood. The walls were scarred with bullet holes. The massive ventilation window had been blown wide open, and sitting against the far wall, illuminated by the pale morning light filtering through the shattered glass, were 2 figures. Master Chief Callahan Braxton was awake. His hands were finally free of the zip ties. His broken leg had been splinted with the shattered remnants of a Spetsnaz rifle stock. Beside him, Kestrel Strickland lay unconscious, her head resting on Braxton's uninjured shoulder. Her left leg was tightly bound in a blood-soaked tourniquet. Her right hand was still loosely curled around the leather handle of her K-bar knife. Pinned firmly beneath her mud-caked combat boots was the heavy, waterproof titanium case containing the stolen drone core. She hadn't just saved her Master Chief, she had finished the mission. The QRF commander lowered his weapon. He signaled his medics forward. "Master Chief," the commander said, his voice hushed with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "We thought," command reported, "the entire squad was wiped out by the flood. How the hell did you survive this? How did you take down an entire Spetsnaz hit squad?" Braxton didn't look at the commander. He didn't look at the dead Russians. He looked down at the 26-year-old woman resting on his shoulder. He looked at the mud on her face, the blood on her hands, and the quiet, peaceful rise and fall of her chest. Braxton slowly raised his right hand. He didn't point to his own chest. He pointed a single, trembling finger down at Kestrel. "Don't call me a legend, Commander," Braxton said, his voice rough as sandpaper, but carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute truth. "I was just the bait. You want to know what happened here? You're looking at her." The medics rushed forward, gently lifting Kestrel onto a rigid stretcher. As they lifted her, a heavy, brass-cased analog compass slipped from the breast pocket of her tactical uniform and clattered softly onto the concrete floor. Braxton reached down and picked it up. He wiped the blood and mud from the glass face. The needle spun for a moment, then settled, pointing perfectly, immutably north. He placed the compass back into Kestrel's hand, wrapping her cold fingers around the heavy brass casing. The high-tech war would continue. The drones would fly, the satellites would orbit, and the screens would glow in air-conditioned command centers halfway across the world. But out here, in the mud, in the blood, and in the storm, the old ways had survived. The analog heart of the American warrior still beat. Kestrel Strickland was loaded onto the helicopter. The rotors pitched, lifting her up out of the valley of death, up through the breaking clouds and into the pale, brilliant light of the morning sun. She had gone out into the dark. She had faced the monsters of the old world. and she had come back.